Welcome to the Travelman Podcast. My name is Ben and I host this cool travel podcast. If you're joining me for the first time, then thanks a heap for listening. On today's episode, I'll be chatting with Rob, a Washington, D.C. tour guide who hosts the YouTube travel channel Trip Hacks DC. He also has a podcast called Trip Hacks DC Podcast. Rob reached out to me on an email to do a podcast episode together, and I said yes, please. So sit back and enjoy the conversation I had with Rob.
Okay, this is Rob from Trip Hacks DC.
Well, thanks for joining me, Rob.
Thanks for having me, Ben. I'm glad to be here.
No problems, mate. First off, I'd like to say congratulations on the Washington Nationals winning the World Series against the Houston Astros. Nationals beat the Astros 6-2 in their final game, am I right?
That is correct. It does feel a little weird to have people congratulate me on the win. You know, as a fan, I'm happy that I was able to support the team, but I wasn't going around and throwing or hitting a ball. But it's very exciting because we've been waiting a long time. The Washington Nationals have had many devastating moments in the past decade, so 2019 was finally the year.
Yeah, have you not been a very successful team?
Well, they've had a good team. Won a lot of games in the regular season, and it's the postseason, the playoffs, where they've struggled.
Okay, my team's the LA Dodgers. I don't think they're that good.
Well, they were pretty good this year, and the Washington Nationals did upset them, so that did upset a lot of folks in LA, but this year just wasn't their year.
Okay, no, that's fair enough, mate. And how's the weather tonight? Tonight, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting because Washington, D.C. is a city with 4 seasons, and so we're currently in November, which means that we're transitioning from fall into winter. So today is actually an excellent day weather-wise. It's cool. I actually prefer it to be a little cool. It's not cold yet. We're not in winter yet, but we're slowly getting there.
Yeah, you're not getting the snow that Chicago just had.
No, Chicago is in a part of the country that gets a whole lot more snow than we do here.
And I think we both agree that we wouldn't want to live there.
Well, it's a great city. I don't want to upset anyone from Chicago. But it does have a bit of a harsh winter. I've been there in the winter as a visitor, and it's a little tough to get used to, I can imagine.
So maybe there's going to be a Trip Hacks Chicago one day.
Maybe. I don't know if I can make any promises, but right now it's just Trip Hacks DC. We'll see where it goes in the future.
Fair enough. Well, you reached out to me on an email and you had some very, very lovely things to say about my podcast, which I appreciate.
Of course, it's a great podcast. I think everyone who's traveling should give it a listen if they haven't already. I just love that it's so down to earth, and you're just
thanks, mate.
You're just a traveler, just like regular people who are going to be going these same places where you've gone. So it's great, fresh perspective.
I try my best. And I heard that a fellow that we both know, Mark Wolters, recommended the podcast to you, that's a massive compliment because he's a very well-known dude in the travel industry and a very lovely guy that you were actually able to take around Washington. Is that right? Recently. Yeah,
not just Mark Wolters, but the whole Wolters family, Jocelyn and the kids as well. They came here on a trip to this part of the country. I think they were going to several different cities on their way around the East Coast of the U.S. And so when they came to Washington, D.C., and unfortunately they were only here for, I think, 2 days, so it wasn't a long time, but I was able to spend one of those days with them. I took them on my Monuments and Memorials tour. I am a tour guide. Trip Hacks DC is ultimately a tour company. And so I got a chance to take them on my Monuments and Memorials tour, and it was just a great time. It was a beautiful June day, a rare, nice summer day, and there were some veterans who were visiting the memorials at the same time as us. That was a very touching experience for everyone in the family.
Oh, that's great. And so was it warm then?
Yeah, so they came in June. We have 4 seasons. June is squarely in the summer. It's not the hottest month of the year. That would be July. So typically in June, it's hot and humid here in DC. And like I said, they got lucky. They came on a day when it was warm but not hot, and surprisingly not very humid.
Okay, well, what are some of your favorite places in Washington, D.C. then?
Well, it's hard to pick favorites because there's so many good ones. But a few that come to mind when people ask me, especially when they come on my tour and they say, well, we're here with you. So we're obviously seeing the monuments, memorials. That's a must do. But what else should we do? And a few places that come to mind are the Library of Congress, beautiful, beautiful building here in the city. Many people consider it to be the most beautiful building in the city. And then right across the street and actually connected to the Library of Congress by an underground tunnel is the Capitol, which is the legislative branch of our government. Over in your part of the world, you might consider it like the Parliament. And so that's where the folks who, are the elected representatives, where they do their work. And so that's a great building to tour as well, because it's big and it's grand and it's beautiful and just a lot of cool stuff to see inside there.
Cool. And that underground tunnel, was that built for a reason?
Well, there's a lot of underground tunnels in Washington, D.C. And one thing that you might discover when you go to the Capitol is that if you want to go to your Congress member's office, their office is not inside the Capitol building itself. It's in a separate office building. And all of those office buildings are connected to the Capitol by an underground tunnel. So it's, a way to get around the city without having to actually go outside. So it's actually not that common to see politicians walking around on the street, especially the ones who are in, the Congress, because they're underground doing their thing down there.
Oh, that's amazing. And your dog seems like he likes to know about the tunnels as well. He's just chirping in there.
Yeah, I do have a dog. I haven't made him the Trip Hacks DC mascot quite yet. We'll see.
Oh, well, as long as he's chewing on a bone.
That's right.
DC, what's that stand for? This probably sounds like the dumbest question in the world.
No, it's actually a very fair question. The DC in Washington, D.C. stands for District of Columbia. So you've been to the U.S., you've been to California, you've been to New York. Those are states, and there's 50 of them. And the District of Columbia is not a state. It's a federal district. It's still obviously part of the country. We still pay the same taxes that people in California or New York pay, but we are actually not part of one of the 50 states.
Oh, wow. So how many districts are there in America other than Washington?
Well, there's several federal territories. So Puerto Rico is one of the most commonly known. Out in the Pacific, there's also Guam. In the Caribbean, there's the Virgin Islands. Right. So there's a few territories of the U.S. that are not states, but they're all a little bit different because in Puerto Rico, they don't have federal income taxes like we do. So that's one of the things that around here is kind of a sticking point, is that we're not a state, which means we don't have elected representatives in the government. And we also pay taxes. So that's why when you come, there are license plates on all the cars that say taxation without representation, because it goes back to the old days when, they were throwing tea in the Boston Harbor because they were upset that the Brits were taxing them and they didn't have any representation in the British government. So it kind of goes back to that.
And that would have been Earl Grey tea as well. The taste.
Not quite sure what they drank back then. That would be a great thing to study up on.
Maybe it was English breakfast.
That would make the most sense to me.
Yeah. So, where's a few places, Rob, that you'd advise a person to visit in Washington, D.C. if they say only had a few days, like the Wolters family?
Yeah. So the way I think about this is, as far as how many days you have, you're going to have to prioritize. So the two places I mentioned earlier are kind of great places for a short trip, the Capitol, the Library of Congress, and then the monuments and memorials as well. Those are kind of, to me, the must-sees. And if you're only going to be here for one day, that's pretty much all you're going to be able to see. If you're here for 2 days, then you can probably also squeeze in a museum or two. And we have the Smithsonian Institution, which is not just one museum. It's not the Smithsonian. It's the Smithsonian Institution. And they have several museums here in D.C. and a few other cities in the country as well. And so the most popular ones are natural history, American history, and air and space. But the most popular ones aren't necessarily the best for everybody. And so what I always advise people to do is to go on the Smithsonian website, take a peek at what museums are here and look at the exhibits that are in them and see what jumps out to you, see what sounds interesting to you, and then maybe go check those out.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough, because there is a Smithsonian, I think, is that in LA? Or is that in New York?
Yeah, the Smithsonian does have a museum in New York, and they also have affiliated museums. So these are not museums that are part of the Smithsonian Institution, but they're private museums that are affiliated with them. So they share some resources. And so those are all over the country as well.
And the Smithsonian is an institution.
Yeah, it's actually an agency of the U.S. government. So it's rare that because it's part of the government, it's all the museums here are completely free to visit. And I know that...
Oh, that's the best.
It's great because, if you go to Paris or you go to some of the other big world cities and you want to go to the museums, it's not cheap. And, you're on vacation, you're willing to spend the money to see them. But when you come here, you don't have to pay a dime if you don't want to. Now, the downside, everything comes with the downside, is that they do get pretty crowded. And so, especially with those three popular ones that I mentioned earlier, if you come during the peak summer season, you can probably expect some crowds. And that's why I always say, if you can come off season, it's an indoor activity and there's not a lot of people here. So that's a great thing that you can do if you come during those slower months.
That's true. You could probably book tickets online to get a better position in the queue, I'm guessing.
Oh, you don't even need tickets. That's the great thing about it. You just show up and go. Right now, there's only one museum that requires a ticket.
Go in. Okay.
Yeah, in 2019, only the Smithsonian African American History and Culture Museum requires a ticket. It's a free ticket.
Free ticket, yeah.
All the rest of them, you just walk up and go. So that's great.
Okay. Nope, that's fair enough. What are some places that you probably tell someone that's traveling to Washington, D.C. to avoid, as in it could be dangerous or it's not worth seeing or things like that?
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and it's a tough question to answer because we don't have places here like Times Square in New York City or Hollywood Boulevard in LA. Those are places to me where if you ask a New Yorker about Times Square, they tell you, I never go there. That's a waste of time. That's, just a tourist trap. And we don't really have that here. That's the great thing about DC, is that even the museums, even the monuments, locals will go to them and have a great time because they're great places and they're not tourist traps. They're not trying to separate you from your money, which is often what you find in a place like Times Square. And so I think that that's one of the coolest things about DC. Now, the way I approach it is I have a list of top 10 things to do. And then I think, well, what's not in my top 10 list that people might be surprised to hear? And the one that I think people are the most surprised to hear is the White House. Now, go to the White House, take a picture from the outside, do all that fun stuff. But to actually go inside the White House is a process that is tedious and it's frustrating. And in the end, you only get to see a small number of rooms inside the building. And I think people get disappointed because when you watch the movies, if you're a fan of Hollywood movies, you always see the Oval Office, you see the Situation Room, the West Wing. And when you come on the tour, you don't get to see that stuff. You get to see the blue room and the green room and the red room and the dining room. And if you haven't heard of these rooms, it's because they're not famous like the ones you see in the movies. And so some people feel a little disappointed about that. The process for going to the White House is complicated. You have to contact your member of Congress in advance.
Oh, really?
And then they relay your request to the White House. And then you wait and you wait. And, you fill out a form with your name and address and date of birth and all that stuff so they can do a background check. And only about 2 weeks before your trip do you find out whether you get to go or not. And unfortunately, at least half, if not more than half of the folks who come on my tour who tried to get a reservation for the White House, they got rejected. They get an email 2 weeks or a week in advance and said, sorry, we had too many requests. We can't accommodate you. And so they don't get to go. So that's one of the things that I say, don't feel bad if you can't go. Don't, feel like you have to spend all this time and invest all this energy into doing it because in the end, you're not going to get to see, I think, what you might want to see. There's a White House Visitor Center across the street, and that's great. And that's very underutilized. So if you're going to come, definitely check that out. And for you, Ben, you're from outside the country. And so if you go on the Embassy of Australia website, you're going to see some language that says, hey, don't even bother contacting us about those White House tours because we can't help you out. And so it's just not something that everybody can do. And it's okay because the visitor center is great. You can go to that.
If I really did want to check that out, do I still go through a member of Congress or do I do it a different way considering I don't live in the US?
Right. So you don't have a member of Congress. And so you don't have that process. So what you would do is you would contact the Australian embassy in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And you would say, hey, I really want to do this. And from what I understand, most of the embassies that get a lot of visitors here, like Australia, Canada, the UK, they're not doing it. And they're even posting on their website like, hey, don't contact us about this because we're not accommodating it. If you're from a smaller country, you might have better luck. I have heard secondhand that folks from other countries have been able to go that route and to get inside.
You know what I would probably find the most interesting is doing a tour of all the tunnels underneath, because I think that would be fabulous and very interesting, and maybe have a little bit of a backstory.
Yeah, for sure. Could definitely check those out.
Yeah, so can people walk underneath there or get a guided tour?
Yeah, so the tunnels, I don't want to make them sound more interesting than they are. They're just transportation. They're just a means to get from one building to another. But you can go down there, and after you take your Capitol tour, you can ask the tour guide if they have any advice, or if you have a friend who lives in DC and knows someone who works in one of those office buildings, they might be able to set something up for you as well. So there's options.
Wow, that would be really cool. Okay, and the thing that's across the way from the White House, what was that called again? Where you can see that instead? Yeah,
so I think the White House Visitor Center is right across the street from the White House.
Am I getting mixed up with two different things, aren't I?
I think it's okay. I think you might be mixing up the White House and the Capitol. The White House is where the president lives. That's the executive branch of our government. The Capitol is where the Congress meets. That's the legislative branch of our government. So two different buildings, two different purposes, both very famous. So
which is the one that gets blown up in Armageddon?
That's the White House.
All right.
And if you're going to watch a movie where the White House gets blown up, I highly recommend Armageddon. That is the best one of that
Isn't
genre.
Isn't that great? Pentagon's in Washington, D.C. too, isn't it?
Yeah, Pentagon is in Virginia. It's only about
is that the same state?
Yeah, it's its own state. It's just across the Potomac River, so you can see it from Washington D.C. On my tour of the monuments memorials, I sometimes will.
Close.
I sometimes will point it out across the water. Now it's huge. It is the largest office building in the world by far. So all those big skyscrapers that are big and famous, those are not as big as the Pentagon. So it is a huge office building.
Because the Pentagon's really wide, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just in a completely different shape than any other building. So it's not thin and tall like most skyscraper office buildings. It's it's not tall. It's still several stories, but it's much wider and takes up a lot of land.
Man, that would be cool to check out.
Yeah, that is actually one that you can check out. That's another one that's not in my top 10 for the simple reason that at the end of the day, it's an office building, and so it's not a museum. And when you go, they do have a small area where they have some exhibits set up and some things that you can see. And so the tour guide will show you that. But that only lasts about 30 to 60 minutes, depending on the pace that they go. And so you can imagine the largest office building in the world, and you're only getting an hour's worth of content. You're really not getting to see all that much.
Now, I reckon probably one of the main things they would get asked a lot is about the terrorist attacks and what part of the building was damaged and what happened there. That'll be
that's definitely something that's part of the story of the Pentagon. September 11th in 2001, New York City and the Pentagon were both attacked, and they actually have a 9/11 memorial at the Pentagon. It's actually very well done.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it's not the easiest to get to. You can take the metro there. There's a station right at the Pentagon, and then you can walk over, but it's a bit of a walk, and it's not really near any of the other sites. And so it's something that typically, unless you're really specifically seeking it out, not something that you're going to do on your way to something else, for example. But it is a great memorial and, worth seeing if you can.
Okay. Well, considering that you mentioned public transport, what's the metro system in Washington like?
So it The answer to this question depends entirely on where in the world you're coming from. For most Americans, it is great. It is one of the best things they've ever used. For locals, it can be frustrating. For people who live in, Tokyo or Seoul or Singapore, Hong Kong, it's,
one of those large Asian cities.
Not the greatest. So it's all about perspective, but we do have a metro system, which is, an underground subway. We also have buses. So it's actually very easy to get around. I don't recommend people, when they come to Washington, D.C., get a rental car at the airport. It's not worth having. It's not worth, the hassle or the price to park it, because once you're inside the city, you're not going to need to drive around to get places. The only time you might need to is if you want to take a trip that's outside the city. And I typically don't recommend them if you only have a short time. But on the chance that you're here for a week or something and there's something outside the city you want to do, that might be the only time you want a rental car.
That's probably the rental car to get to the Pentagon, or could you take the Washington, D.C. Metro?
Yeah, you can take the Metro. There's a station called Pentagon. And once you get off there, it's a short walk over to the memorial. The only reason people don't go there as much as they do to the other memorials is it's just kind of out of the way.
No, that's fair enough. And what about taking the Metro from the airport? Have they got a Metro link?
Yeah, so we have three airports.
There's three
airports. So it's, many big cities have multiple airports. I know in New York they have at least 3 airports as well.
Melbourne has one.
Only one of those 3 is connected to the Metro right now in 2019. There will be another one at some point in the future. The one that's connected to the Metro is Reagan National Airport. It's very close to the city. It's actually very close to the Pentagon. And so it's so close to the city that when you're sitting on the runway, you can see the Washington, D.C. landmarks. You can see the Capitol Dome. You can see the Washington Monument. And so once you get off the plane, short walk over to the metro station, and then you're in the city in 15 minutes. Very, very convenient. The other 2 airports, there's Dulles International Airport. So if you're traveling in from farther away, you're probably going to wind up there, especially if you're coming from Europe or some international destination. You'll wind up at Dulles. And that one's in Virginia. That's pretty far away by, our standards compared to Reagan National, but it's actually the same distance as most American airports from the city center. They are building a metro line out to Dulles Airport. Now it keeps getting delayed. So the running joke in town is, who knows when it'll actually be ready. I think people were hoping for next year, might be waiting an extra year at this point. But once that's open, it'll be much more convenient. It'll still take a long time to get out there because it's so far, but it'll be a lot easier than having to navigate the buses or the taxis that you do now. And then we have we have another airport, Baltimore Washington Airport. Technically the airport for Baltimore. It's the farthest of the 3. There is a train that comes into
Baltimore?
Town. Yeah, Baltimore is a city about 40 miles to our north, so not far. But yeah, we share an airport. It actually, is south of Baltimore, so it's kind of in between.
Okay, fair enough. And if you were coming from Reagan National on the Metro, is it a long ride in, or is it only like half an hour in the Metro?
It's not even half an hour. Depends exactly where you're staying. If you're staying in the heart of downtown, I'm trying to count on my fingers here, 5 metro stops, maybe 6 to get right into the heart of the city. And that's only going to take you about 15 minutes.
What's the best area to stay in Washington? There must be some really cool, hip suburbs for, for couples, and there are obviously better suburbs for families. But what, in your opinion, are some of the best places to stay in Washington?
Well, to me, the best place to stay is downtown, right near the White House. And that's specifically for first-time visitors. I think that's a great spot because it's just convenient to everything that you're going to want to do, especially on a first time in Washington, D.C. And it's close to transportation. There's multiple metro lines over there. It's walkable to most things. If you are up for it, you can walk and the weather's good. You can walk to the White House, you can walk to the Smithsonian museums, you can walk to the monuments and memorials. And so Washington, D.C. is a pretty good walking city, actually, as long as you stay within fairly close distance of things.
So
I really recommend that area for that reason.
Okay. Is Washington a flat city? So it's not hilly like San Francisco.
That's actually an interesting question. It's actually a very hilly city, and that surprises people because they don't go to the part of the city that's very hilly. Downtown near the White House, the area I just recommended, is actually relatively flat. And so if you come to DC and you're only here for a few days, you only go to the stuff around that area, you might leave thinking that there's no hills here. But if you go in any direction, north, south, east, or west, you're going to start getting some hills. And people notice this when they go to the National Zoo, which is, a few miles to the north of downtown. And the National Zoo is actually built on a hill. So when you're walking around inside the zoo, you're walking uphill and then you're walking downhill. And this can be a really exhausting day if you weren't expecting it and weren't prepared for it.
Do you recommend people to go see your National Zoo? Because I love zoos.
Yeah, the zoo's great, but I will say that it's not the biggest or the grandest zoo in America. So I would say the San Diego Zoo, the Memphis Zoo.
I was going to say the same thing.
Those zoos are spectacular. And if you're a big zoo person, those are the ones where you're going to have the best time because you're going to see the most animals. The National Zoo, in many ways, is kind of like a little neighborhood zoo. And that's great because it's not too big, but that also means that they don't have the most animals. But the one thing that does set it apart is that it's completely free because it's part of the Smithsonian Institution. So you don't have to pay. There's no tickets. You just show up and you go. And the other thing that makes it great is that there's only 4 zoos in the United States right now that have giant pandas. And the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. is one of those 4. And the only one of those 4 that's completely free.
And my mate Chris Rainey from Yellow Productions, he loves giant pandas. He loves pandas.
I seem to have bad luck with the pandas because every time I go to the zoo, they're asleep.
Yeah. They sleep because all they do is eat bamboo all the time. And talking about bamboo, what are some local delicacies that a traveler can try in Washington, D.C.?
So there's nothing signature like you would have in some cities. And what I mean by that is if you hear Philadelphia, you would say cheesesteak. And if you hear Boston, you would say clam chowder. And you hear Washington, D.C., and you kind of scratch your head and you say, what is it? So there's no one thing that's a fine defining delicacy, food-wise for Washington, D.C. But we do have many things that kind of are unique to the area. So the one that I always recommend is Ethiopian food. And you might wonder why Ethiopian food, and it's because there are more Ethiopian immigrants in Washington, D.C. than any other U.S. city. And they have a lot of restaurants here, and they're fantastic restaurants. For the most part, they're not catering to tourists. They're catering to locals. They're catering to other Ethiopian immigrants. And so it's just really, really excellent food. And at least in the U.S., it's a fairly rare cuisine. Not a lot of cities even have an Ethiopian restaurant. And so when you come to D.C. and you see these all over the place, you kind of get curious and you wonder about them and you go, and it's just a really fantastic experience.
Yeah, that is a strange thing. I wouldn't have thought that Washington, D.C. would be full of Ethiopian restaurants. I would have thought Melbourne, yes. I would have gone, no problems, heaps of Ethiopian restaurants here. But I don't think people know enough about Washington, D.C.'s food culture, if they had a culture. If there was an Ethiopian restaurant, or so forth, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think when the Wolters were here last year, they asked me this exact same question, and I sent them to an Ethiopian restaurant. And they texted me the next day that it was one of the best things that they did on the trip, or at least one of the best things that they ate on the trip. So everybody in the family loved it. It's actually a great family-friendly cuisine because there's no silverware. You eat it with your hands. They put the meat and the vegetables on top of injera, which is this Ethiopian flatbread, and you roll up the bread and you scoop up the meat and the vegetables and you eat it that way. So it's really great for everybody in the family.
And I think you scoop it into sauce, don't you?
Yeah, some of the vegetables do look a little saucy. I don't know if that's the right terminology. I'm not an expert in this cuisine, but that definitely kind of describes how I've seen it.
Okay. Harping back on Washington, the surrounds, you know how you said it's hilly and so forth. Is there some really cool forests or national parks nearby if someone did have a little bit extra time in Washington, D.C., they could take a car, hire a car out and see some nice forests or woodlands nearby?
Yeah, I would say you don't even need to get the car. There's a park right in the middle of the city. It's called Rock Creek Park. And
is that like a botanical garden?
No, it's
not
just
really.
We actually have a lot of similar things. We have a botanic garden that's near the Capitol. We have a national arboretum that's a little bit outside the city as well. And then what I'm describing, Rock Creek Park, is basically just a big park or, an urban forest in many ways.
Like Central Park in a way.
Yeah, a lot fewer people though. Bigger,
That's
actually
nice.
Much bigger than Central Park, square
really?
footage-wise or mileage-wise. Fewer people. It's not a tourist attraction the way that Central Park is, but it's similar in that they're both big green spaces in the middle of the city. And it's part of the national park system. One of the guests I actually had on the Trip Hacks DC podcast was talking about it, and he said he's actually been in the park and at times, just taking a moment to stop, look around and listen.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't hear any city noise, no honking taxi drivers, no, kids playing around in the neighborhoods, just complete forest silence. And to me, that's amazing.
That is awesome.
Yeah, you can be right in the middle of the city and you're also in the middle of the forest at the same time. I don't know if there's a lot of other places where you can experience something like that, but you can definitely do that here.
Especially if you can't see the skyline.
Oh, no, you don't see
really
anything.
Cool.
You just see trees, wildlife. We have deers who live in there. And so
yeah, you have deers that live in there.
Oh, there's a lot of deers that live in there. It's actually kind of a ecological problem, but that's a story for another time.
Okay, tell me about that No, I'm just joking. That's really cool. And you said there was a botanic garden nearby as well and an arboretum. Are they nice for travelers to look at?
Oh, definitely. I highly recommend the botanic gardens. They have both indoor and outdoor exhibits. The indoor exhibits are greenhouses where they recreate
like a tropical greenhouse.
Exactly. Yeah, climates from all around the world. I like to go in there and find plants that I know aren't native to here. Coffee, for example, my favorite drink. Can't grow coffee in the U.S. except for Hawaii. But you go in the botanic gardens and they've got coffee trees all over the place. And to me, that's really, really cool, really awesome. The National Arboretum, I've heard described as a museum of trees. It's mostly outdoors and they've just got so many different local plants that can grow around here and really well curated too.
Okay. Keeping on talking about people visiting Washington, is there anything unique to Washington which you'd advise a traveler to see or to make sure that they don't miss out on?
Yeah, so, the things that I mentioned earlier are kind of my must-sees. I think there's so much that you can do here that is completely free, that, the museums, the Capitol, the National Archives, which is where the Declaration of Independence and
that's cool. That's very interesting stuff.
The original versions are both located.
And most Americans should see that as well, shouldn't they, Rob?
Oh, yeah. I think it's really fascinating because those documents are well over 200 years old. And in some ways, it's kind of amazing that they're still, they haven't disintegrated. They're not dust. Obviously, they have gone to great effort to keep them. Now, you're not going to stand there and read them, obviously, because we have copies of both those documents in lots of different places. But just to be able to see these and say like, wow, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, they were involved in this. Wow. They actually put pen and paper to this thing, this actual thing. That's pretty cool.
That is so cool.
But the other thing, as far as what should you see, I think once you're done seeing the sights, seeing all the stuff,
the main attractions
down there, go into some of the neighborhoods, go for a walk, just, explore a little bit, go into some coffee shops and ask the barista, what cool stuff is nearby that they could go. You don't have to do everything as part of a set plan. You don't have to have a giant checklist and everything's just checking it off a list. Some days it's just fun to go into the neighborhoods. Georgetown is very popular. That's where, John F. Kennedy lived in the 60s.
That's
and
right.
where
Yes.
a lot of well-to-do people lived at that era. Capitol Hill near the Capitol is a very nice neighborhood with the classic Washington, D.C. row houses. So a lot of people like to go and just look at the houses and take it in. So there's lots of cool neighborhoods.
I know nothing about the row houses. What's the row houses, Rob? Sorry.
If you've ever seen any TV show or movie, they probably have a scene where the characters are going into these row houses. They were built at various times throughout history, some as far back as the 1800s and into the 1900s as well. And row houses are basically just houses that share walls. So instead of, each house being its own building, you have a whole block, and every single house on the block is connected to each other. So they share houses, they share walls, and their houses right in a row, hence the term row house.
Are they, are those row houses, are some of them heritage listed so they can't get knocked down?
Yeah, there's a lot of historic preservation, a lot of historic district rules. It actually can be kind of a pain if you want to be a homeowner in Washington, D.C. If you purchase a home in a historic district, there's very strict rules about what you're allowed to do to your own house. And so some people really don't like that. They go shopping for new windows, for example, and they find out, you're not allowed to have this type of glass, or you're not allowed to have this type of frame around your window because of the historic district. So there's pros and cons both ways.
Yeah, I know in Melbourne, certain parts of Melbourne, you have to keep the facade of the property, but you can destroy everything else behind it. So as long as you still have the original face of the house, that's enough in a sense.
Yeah, I think there's probably similar rules here. One of the big hot topics right now are solar panels. People want to install solar panels on their roof. And if you live in one of these historic districts, if you can see the solar panels from the street, then you might not be allowed to install them, which seems silly, but that's the rule. At least it is right now.
No, that's fair enough. I was going to ask you a question about all the monuments in Washington, D.C. Why has Washington, D.C. got so many monuments? And obviously they're all dedicated to great leaders and past presidents. Is that pretty much correct?
Yeah, so the monuments, at least the ones that I show folks on my tour, it's actually split into two categories. So one is great people from our history, mostly former presidents, one non-president, Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights leader in the 1960s. And then the other category are the war memorials. And so we have national war memorials for World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, and a few others planned or in the works right now. And so it's a combination of, former historic people and also, for people who fought in our country's wars. And the monuments are actually relatively new. So our country was founded in 1776. That's when, the Declaration of Independence was signed. And the memorials have mostly been built in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. And so it's a fairly recent phenomenon, at least as far as our country's history goes, or our city's history goes. So they haven't always been here. When you come and look at them, they feel like they've always been here. The Lincoln Memorial the Lincoln Memorial right now is 97 years old. They're going to celebrate their 100th birthday in a few years. Maybe by the time some of your listeners find this podcast, the Lincoln Memorial will be 100 years old. So that's one of the older ones. But
earlier.
Yeah, most of them are not more than 40 years old.
Okay, fair enough. And considering the age of the US, which would be a few hundred years now, isn't it? If it was started in 1778. Am I
1776. Right? So close.
So close. Well, considering the age of America, what's the age of Washington? And was that one of the first cities built, or because it's on the...
No, it wasn't actually. It's actually a fairly fascinating story.
Okay.
The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. George Washington did not become the first president until a decade after that. And George Washington was the first president, and he was one of the folks who helped choose Washington, D.C. to be the permanent capital. Before that, Philadelphia was mostly the capital. New York City had served as the capital. Originally, the capital was kind of defined as wherever the Congress was, wherever the leaders were, that was the capital. There wasn't a permanent city established yet. And so it moved around. Like I said, it was mostly Philadelphia, but it moved around. It was in a few different places. And so George Washington, helped establish it here. But there was a big debate back in those days about what should be the capital. And there's a hit Broadway play right now called Hamilton. So a lot of folks have learned that Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, two men from back then, they didn't really get along so well, and they disagreed on a lot of things, including the location of the capital. And Hamilton, thought that the capital should be in a place like New York City, the big city. At that time, London was the capital of England, and so the big city should be the capital. Jefferson didn't agree. He thought it should be a place where just the government was, and not a lot else, not the banks, not the business, stuff like that. And so in the end, Jefferson's vision for the capital kind of won out, and we wound up putting it down near where he lived in near Virginia. And George Washington was helpful in selecting this very specific location for Washington, D.C.
Okay. How old is Washington, D.C.?
On the spot, I don't know the exact year, but
is it 100 plus years? Probably?
Oh, yeah, a little more than 200 years.
Because of the history of Washington, D.C., it would have many, many grisly happenings that have happened in the past.
Oh, yeah.
But
the city's haunted.
There's no ghost tours, though, is there?
Oh, there are ghost tours. There's definitely ghost tours. Now, I personally don't lead ghost tours. Ghost tours are tough. The thing about ghost tours is they're tough because they might not be scary. And sometimes people sign up for the tour and they want to be scared. They want it to be like an amusement park where ghouls and goblins are jumping out of the bushes at them or something. I'm not quite sure.
No, I don't like those type of tours. I like the ones where you're still hearing about the creepy past, but it's more historical.
Oh, yeah. So those are the ones that we mostly have around here. I don't personally lead them, but I know that there are many people and many companies who do them. The Capitol building, for example, is definitely haunted. We've had several people who perished there. There's a cat. It's a tabby cat that haunts the Capitol. Some people see the cat around. John Quincy Adams was a former president of the U.S., and he served as president during a different time, back when after you were finished being president, you had to go find a job because it wasn't just autobiographies and speaking deals. So he actually went back to being a Congress member, and he actually died, on the floor of the House of Representatives. And so there's, they say that he haunts the place as well as a few other folks who had untimely demises inside the building.
Oh, have you got any other creepy stories or ghost sightings which you know of?
There's a few other places where ghosts are known to be. Georgetown, one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. Very popular place for ghost tours, especially around Halloween time. We're a little bit past Halloween right now, but I know for a fact that there were a lot of tour guides out for Halloween dressed up in, special costume, giving a ghost tour of Georgetown. Alexandria, Virginia, not inside Washington, D.C., but in Virginia, a few miles away. They do have some ghost stories over there as well.
Ooh, I got to get myself to Virginia after, obviously, I've seen Washington, D.C. Now, considering you've spoken about Virginia just now, do you like Virginia? Do you get out there much?
Oh, yeah, sure. There's some great sites in Virginia. I mean, obviously, the Pentagon 9/11 Memorial that I mentioned earlier is there. Oh, yeah. Mount Vernon is George Washington's home. So, one of the reasons why he probably liked the location of Washington, D.C. is because it wasn't too far from his home. So it's only a few miles away. And it's a private historic residence. So you do have to pay to go, but it's worth it because it's really cool to see, where George Washington lived and, the history that's preserved there. And then Monticello is where Thomas Jefferson lived. And that's a little bit farther away. That's in Charlottesville, Virginia, but you can see his home as well. And there's a lot of wineries over in Charlottesville, Virginia as well. That surprises some people who think that all the wine comes from California, but there's actually a good number of grapes over in that part of Virginia as well.
Okay. If someone were to want to drink something local in Washington or Virginia, would you point them towards wine or beer or both?
I would say beer is probably a better bet if you want something local. A lot of beer brewed in Washington, D.C. now. That's a fairly recent phenomenon. There were a lot of breweries back a long time ago before Prohibition. I'm not sure how familiar you are with our history, but we had a prohibition of alcohol at one point about 100 years ago. And then, unfortunately...
I was around.
Of course, yeah. a lot of the breweries dried up. And so for a long time, it was just these big mega breweries like Budweiser and Coors and those. And, there's been in the last couple decades a big renaissance of these small local breweries. And every city in America, I think, has them. One thing I find funny when I travel around myself is that every city seems to think that they invented local breweries. And they're everywhere, including here. So if you want something local, beer is definitely a good option. We do have a couple of wineries in the city now.
Yeah.
They actually
really?
ferment the grapes right in the city. Now, they don't grow the grapes in the city. They import them from other places. So
from Virginia,
depending
maybe?
on what you consider local, that may or may not fit the bill.
It's kind of local. I mean, if they're squashing the grapes in Washington, D.C. and yeah, that's kind of local. And what are your favorite places to visit outside of Washington, D.C.? Is Virginia one of them? Have you got some other places that you like to visit?
Yeah.
In U.S. cities?
I like Virginia. I like to go down to Busch Gardens, which is in Williamsburg, Virginia. That's an amusement park. It's owned by SeaWorld. So if you've ever been to a SeaWorld, it's similar to that. I really like to go to Philadelphia. It's great for the history. It was the capital of the country for a short while there. And they've got a lot of great history up there, as well as good food, good drinks, good, everything that a big city has. And then New York City, of course, is just a great place to visit. Now, one thing I caution, because people ask me about this a lot, is about taking a day trip to New York City, because, we have...
Is that possible?
It's possible, but not recommended.
Okay.
The train to get there takes 3.5 hours each way. So I say, why do you want to sit on a train for 7 hours just for less than a day of exploring in New York City? Because you've been to New York City, you know how huge it is. And
it's massive.
You can't cram everything into one day. You can't cram everything into 1 week. So to go for 1 day is just a tease. You're not going to be able to see nearly enough.
When you're traveling, do you stick to the East Coast more so than the West Coast or the middle of America?
Well, I'm not much of a traveler. I'm not like you or Chris or Mark or any of the other folks we've talked about. Unfortunately, because I'm here running my tour business, I don't get a chance to travel a lot.
To see anything else. No, that's fair.
So for that reason, I do tend to stick to the East Coast, just because everything's closer. You can get places a lot faster. If I were to go out to Los Angeles, it would take 6 hours sitting on the plane.
Wow,
and
6 hours.
6 hours one direction, 5 hours and something minutes the other direction. It's a long way. I'm speaking to you. It takes forever to travel anywhere from Melbourne, but around here we have a lot of cities that are closer together. So to go to California is kind of a big trip.
Okay, and what about to go to Florida? Is that an even bigger trip, or is that the same, or a bit less?
No, Florida's not as far as California. It does take 2.5 hours, depending on exactly which city you're going to. I've been to Florida several times.
You've been to Miami?
I've been to Miami. I've been to Orlando. Yeah. I've been to Tampa. It's great. I'm not really a beach person. So it's really popular for... Yeah, it's really popular for the beaches, but that's not really my style. So Florida's not my choice usually. Orlando's huge because of Disney. People like to see Mickey Mouse. And I like amusement parks. I like theme parks. Like the first thing I mentioned was Busch Gardens, the amusement park in Virginia.
So you're a theme park nut.
Yeah, I like them a lot. Disney World is not my personal favorite of all the parks that are out in the world, but I know a lot of people like it.
Yeah, apparently that new Star Wars ride, I think it's in Disneyland, is really good. If you're a Star Wars
since
fan.
Disney got the rights to Star Wars, people have just clamoring to go to those parks to check it out.
Yeah, I think Chris Rainey, again, Yellow Productions, he did something recently on the Star Wars, so maybe you want to check that out, see what he did. But he walked right through it. I think he did a walking tour thing there.
Oh, cool.
So talking about you being a tour guide, what got you into it?
Well, I've been a tour guide for a while. This is, I think, my 7th year
your full-time
as a tour
job?
guide. It's not my full-time job. I have a day job, but I've always enjoyed giving tours because big history guy. I love showing people the city. Love taking people to the sites. I especially love first-time visitors. My favorite folks to show are first-time visitors because when I see people's faces light up when they see the Lincoln Memorial, the statue of Abe Lincoln in there, that's just a really great thing to experience, and to think that, man, this is my job too. That's pretty cool. But I did about 4 years of tour guiding for another company, a big tour company here in DC, and I liked it. I liked those guys. But I always kind of really wanted to go and do my own thing. And so I finally found an opportunity to do that about 3 years ago. That's when I started Trip Hacks DC. And it's also a YouTube channel and a podcast. And that's how most customers find me, or through those. And so it's great. They get to, hang out with me on the videos and the podcast. And then when they get here, I get to show them around, or one of my great guides gets to show them around.
Yeah, I've watched a few of your videos recently just to see what you were about when you contacted me. And yeah, you really got it good. Yeah, you come off really sincere and warm, and I really like your style. I think it's great.
Well, I appreciate that. I just want to be as realistic as possible, because there's so much in the travel space these days with Instagram, photographed Instagrams, photoshopped Instagrams, and unrealistic things, and setting people's expectations incorrectly.
How many have you done? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I don't want to set anyone's expectations incorrectly. I want them to know that it's going to be a great time when they visit, but that it might, not be what they see everywhere.
And you know what? For one of my final questions, you kind of answered it, because when you said you really can't get out of DC, and that's why you do the tour around Washington, D.C. Now I know why your YouTube channel and podcast channel is Trip Hacks DC, because really you're the tour guide for Washington, D.C., and you're more than likely to only do the content on Washington, D.C., because that's all really you can do. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think when you asked me about it originally, you asked if I thought I was pigeonholing myself into doing DC. And it's probably true, although I think in the business community, we might say that it's niching down or something like that, creating a niche.
Yeah.
And I think that that's absolutely right. And, people ask me about expanding the tour business to other cities. You could do Trip Hacks New York. You could do Trip Hacks Chicago. The possibilities are endless. And the thing is that I couldn't do those. Yeah, Trip Hacks LA. I couldn't do those because I don't live in any of those places. And so, I have over 100 Washington, D.C. travel videos right now. I could spend a bunch of time and effort researching those cities and making videos about them, but I think it would be obvious. I think it would really show that I don't live there. I haven't traveled there. I don't have any inside knowledge. And that's one of the things that makes Trip Hacks DC to be a success. That's sort of the secret sauce, is that I'm always on top of what's happening here. And I can be, because it's my backyard and it's where I'm running this business. And so I don't think I have the ambition to, expand into other cities. I should be careful just in case I ever do. People are going to find this podcast and hold me accountable. But at least in the near future, I think that Washington, D.C. is definitely where I'm going to stick to it.
And you, like you said, you've got enough content to last you for years.
There is currently over 100 videos at the time we're recording this in 2019, which I was just thinking about the other day. How did I ever possibly make 100 of these things?
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Well done.
One at a time, same way you made all your podcasts, just one at a time. And it's and there's still so much more. I mean, I have a list with over 100 ideas on it right now of things that I could do in the future.
You do what I do. Yeah.
I'm not running out of ideas, that's for sure.
That's good. So there's plenty of content to come. And if anyone wants anything Washington, D.C. related, they definitely should look up YouTube and look up Trip Hacks DC, because it's the best content for anyone wanting to visit Washington, D.C.
Well, thanks for saying that. That's kind of what I was going for, what I was hoping for.
You've done well, my friend. I have some final questions for you, if I may. I ask everyone this, and probably at the end of the year, I might compile a bunch of them and put it into one podcast. So I think it could be really cool.
That is cool.
Yeah, thank you. If you could travel anywhere in the world right now, where would you like to be? And why?
I'd probably come see you over in Australia, because we're going into winter and you're going into summer. And so it would be great to see that. I've never been over there. It's obviously the farthest part of the world away from me. So it's always been a bit of a challenge. And so if I could find a couple weeks to take off, to take free, I'd love to come over and see you in your part of the world.
Well, you could see I think you were saying earlier when we were chatting on the telephone that your sister lives in Sydney.
Yeah, they're over there right now.
That's fantastic. You've got a reason to come, sir.
I know, exactly. It's the challenge is that for us Americans, we don't get as much holiday time or vacation time as other parts of the world. So we to travel a long distance is, several days just in travel. And that's the challenge, but hopefully I'll be able to solve that soon enough.
Well, you could go to Sydney for a week, obviously spend some time with your sister. It won't cost you a thing. You come down to Melbourne, you could see me. That's obviously going to cost you something because you'll have to find accommodation unless I have a room for you. And you could also do Brisbane up north.
Oh, cool.
In Queensland. And even go even further to Cairns and do the Great Barrier Reef, which I'm sure you've heard about.
Oh, I've heard about it. Yeah, sounds awesome.
That is awesome, and it's still nice too. So don't believe anything you hear. The coral is bleached in some parts, obviously, but there's some parts where it's still quite nice.
Cool.
Yeah. So what would you like to be eating or drinking right now if you could, and it's anything from around the world?
Well, I would be drinking coffee because that's my favorite drink. Anywhere I go, I always seek out the local coffee shops.
What type of coffee?
Oh, I just like regular black coffee.
Oh, yeah, you're a black coffee guy.
Yeah, although I will say that if it's a place that's hot, I want an iced coffee. And I learned in my own travels that some parts of the world don't serve iced coffee the same way that they do here in the U.S.
Okay.
So I wound up having to ask for an iced Americano or something like that to get close to what I'm looking for. But it's hot in Washington, D.C., so about 6 months out of the year, I'm drinking iced coffee. The other 6 months out of the year, I'm drinking hot coffee. As far as what I would be eating, well, it depends on where I am, because one of the great things about traveling is that you get to try the local delicacies. And you asked me about the ones here because I assume that if you ever come to Washington, D.C., you want to know what to eat. And I'm exactly the same way. I want to know when I go to any new place, what's the local thing to eat and where can I get it? So that's exactly what I would be eating.
Okay, so I'm thinking if you were traveling to Australia, you'd probably want to try maybe a kangaroo. Have you got any interest in trying any kangaroo?
Is that what you eat?
Or crocodile?
I certainly would give it a try. The only thing I won't try is Vegemite because I've had that already, and that is not my kind of thing.
Yeah. Crocodile's okay. It tastes like chicken.
I have had that. It does taste like chicken. You're right.
Yeah. You would have had alligator, no? Not crocodile.
Oh, maybe I did. Can't remember what I've had. It was a while ago. Can't say I've had it recently.
And was that in DC or was that down in Florida where you would have had it?
No, it was either in Florida or Texas or Louisiana, somewhere down there, somewhere near the Gulf of Mexico.
That's funny. Louisiana is one place I really want to go to in the US.
Yeah, I've been there. Highly recommend it. Excellent place to visit.
I want to do this smoked meat.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, delicious. It's making me hungry now, and I haven't had lunch. I'll ask you one final question. So, what's your favorite country and favorite city?
Well, this seems like a setup because am I allowed to say anything other than the United States and Washington, D.C.? That's obviously my favorite country and city.
I knew that was coming. From
I imagine.
Tripex DC guy. I knew you'd say that.
But I should give you something else too, right?
Yeah.
So, I haven't been everywhere in the world, so this isn't something that I can say of all the great places I've been, this is my favorite. But I really like the big cities. I really like New York. I really like London. I like Paris. And so there's just something to me about those big mega cities that's just so cool. And they're all so unique. They're similar in some ways, but they're so unique in many other ways. And I just love how lively they are, how diverse they are. You can see and do so much. So that's not really a great single answer for you, but I think that's a true one.
That's a wonderful answer. Wonderful. Because I will compile them and put them all in a podcast at the end of the year, probably something like that. I don't know exactly.
Hear that. It sounds fascinating to me.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're someone that's been listening to all my podcast episodes, you use single person, because we always have to feel like we're talking to one person when we podcast, apparently. But they would know all the favorite countries and cities, but may have forgotten. So that's why when you compile them all into one episode, it's probably cool. Yeah,
of course.
I think I will do that.
Yeah, do it. It's going to be great.
Yeah, I will. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Rob. That was awesome.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for having me. It was a great chat. I can't believe the hour already flew by. Feels like we just started.
Really? Oh, wow. Oh, yeah, 1 hour and 58 seconds. Counting
down. Time flies when you're having fun.
That's true, mate. You've made it very easy for me. You answered those questions lovely. And believe it or not, I was adding questions as we spoke, because a lot of those I just came up with on the spot.
Cool.
I feel smart now. Well, enjoy the win from the Washington Nationals. I'm sure you're still celebrating. And I'll bid you farewell. Rest up, and it's probably your sleep time now, isn't it?
It is. It's lunchtime where you are, but in my time of the world, it is getting ready for
11. Is it 11 p.m. nearly? Is that right? It is 11
p.m. over here. That's right.
Yeah, it's nearly 2 p.m. here, but tomorrow for you.
It was worth staying up late for.
Oh, well, awesome. Thanks, mate. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I appreciate it too.
Thanks, pal. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, listener. We forgot to say how you can contact us. You can always contact me at travelmanpodcast.com, email travelmanpodcast@gmail.com. I have an Instagram, Travelman Podcast. I have a private one, Travelman Podcast or Travelman Ben. I have Twitter, which is Travelman Pod. I'm on Facebook, Travelman Podcast. You can find me on all good podcast apps, Spotify, iTunes, all that stuff. You can follow Rob on his YouTube travel channel, and that's TripHacksDC. He's got a website, triphacksdc.com. He also has a podcast, TripHacksDC, so look that up on podcast apps. TripHacksDC. Rob's on Instagram at TripHacksDC. Rob's on Twitter at TripHacksDC. And he's got a Facebook, TripHacksDC. So look up Rob, look up myself, and ciao.